Hello ladies and gentlemen. Before we begin, I'm trying to stay spoiler-free regarding the DLC previews that dropped last week. I've watched the official trailers, but the Bandai marketing is something I'd rather stay clear of, so I would very much appreciate it if you can refrain from spoiling anything in the comments to this video. Now, on to the video. Melina is our constant companion throughout the entire game, and yet there's very little information about her. In fact, no other character or item description ever explicitly mentions her. So let's start by taking stock of everything that we can glean about her. She wears the Traveler's set and wields the Blade of Calling. She can be summoned for the Morgott fight, and as a phantom she maneuvers like a Black Knife assassin and uses two unique moves. One is to summon a Tree of Golden Light, which provides a healing aura. This is also automatically cast when she dies. The other calls down a Deluge of Light similar to the move cast by Miranda Flowers and the cut item Miranda's Prayer. In appearance, she has strawberry blonde hair, her right eye is golden, and her left eye is sealed with a three-fingered claw mark. In the Frenzied Flame ending, her hair is black and short, her golden eye is faded, and her sealed eye is open, revealing a dark purple color. From her dialogue, she is burned and bodiless, she was born at the foot of the Erd Tree, and she has a mother. In terms of abilities, she can turn rune fragments into strength, she can recite the echoes of Queen Marika, and she can transport us to the Round Table Hold outside of this world. She seems unable to govern her own movements except at the base of the Erd Tree, relying on us and potentially Torrent prior to our arrival in order to move around. In terms of worldview, she's opposed to the Frenzied Flame, and her purpose is to allow us to pass the Mantle of Thorns and stand before the Elden Ring, a purpose given to her by her mother inside the Erd Tree, which is the reason she lives burned and bodiless. Ultimately, though, she acts of her own volition, regardless of her mother's designs. Okay, there's a lot there. Let's start with clothing. Melina wears the Traveler's set, which is also worn by Millicent and her sisters. I think this is clearly meant to draw a parallel between Melina and Millicent. That whatever Millicent is in relation to Melina, Melina is something analogous in relation to Marika. The parallel isn't just about clothes, though. Both Melina and Millicent have lost part of their memory, and they're both searching for their purpose. This is alluded to in the description for the Traveler's clothes, worn by young women who set off into the world to confront their fate. I would argue that in both cases, the maidens represent a kind of alternative worldview and outcome, determined by free will instead of succumbing to a higher power. Let me explain what I mean. Melina was born into rot. From birth, she was cursed by the influence of this outer god. Gowry describes the Order of Rot as a cycle of decay and rebirth, and Melina exemplifies this as she is reborn as a goddess upon the third blooming of her scarlet flower. Perhaps this is a kind of death and rebirth, but it's not annihilation, it's just a kind of transformation. Melina as she was ends up dying in a sense, but she is replaced by a transformed version of herself. In other words, rot doesn't truly destroy you, it just transforms who you are. It kills who you were before. That means that in some sense, resisting the scarlet rot is about remaining yourself. To give more context to this, we should look at why Melina stopped resisting the rot. Melina has never known defeat, but when she faced Radahn, he was such a Chad that the battle led to a stalemate. She couldn't beat him just relying on her own skill. But she couldn't handle not winning, so she sacrificed her integrity as a warrior to unleash a giant cancer bomb in Aeonia, winning by any means necessary. This seems to be where Millicent comes from. Gowry says he discovered her as a mere babe in the swamp of Aeonia, and I think the implication is that she just sort of sprung into being as a result of Melina's bloom. The fact that we acquire the Traveler set from another Aeonian flower also supports this. I think the key here is that Millicent and her sisters were born by an act of Melina's weakness of character. She couldn't handle defeat, and so she abandoned her dignity and allowed herself to be used as a kind of conduit for this outer god. Millicent, on the other hand, represents an alternative to that. Gowry tells us that when Melina ascends to godhood, Millicent will also be reborn as a Scarlet Valkyrie. But Millicent doesn't do that. She takes the needle out of her flesh and chooses to die, Her reasoning being that if she's to flower into something other than herself, she would rather just rot into nothingness as she is. Essentially, Melina was so salty about losing that she used a cheat code to beat Radahn, and Millicent is like an alternate version of Melina who didn't stoop that low. Perhaps Millicent even is the very sense of dignity that Melina discarded. Melina chose winning at the cost of turning into someone else, but Millicent chose death rather than abandon who she was. So now let's return to Melina. Given the parallel between Melina and Millicent, I think that when Melina says she was born at the foot of the Erd Tree, it strongly suggests she sprung into being in a similar way to Millicent and her sisters. In my video on the Crucible, I described the Crucible in terms of certain characteristics, two of those being the color red and imagery of a chaotic mass of roots. It's interesting that the Aeonian Swamp seems to exhibit those characteristics, and it makes me think that the Scarlet Rot is somehow integral to the Crucible, and perhaps the very birth of the Erd Tree. Perhaps the Aeonian Swamp is something like a flower crucible, as mentioned in the cut item Miranda's Prayer, which summons a deluge of light exactly like Melina does. Melina talks about her mother, but she's also confused when Bok talks about his mother. Now, I think it's reasonable to assume that Melina's mother is Marika, but that doesn't necessarily mean she's just a normal child. I think some important context here is to recognize that there is a theme of adopted daughters in Elden Ring. There's Millicent, Raya, Nefeli, Rodrika, and I would argue even potentially Ranni. It's my view that Ranni is actually the child of Marika, based on a variety of factors, but most importantly the symbolism of the cuckoo in Raya Lucaria. Actually, a slightly unhinged idea I had is that Ranni might have been born from Mikla's discarded rune in the Amber Egg, but that's a story for another time. I think that in the context of this theme of adopted daughters, Melina is probably Marika's daughter in a sense, but not necessarily a child born from the copulation of a man and woman. Millicent says she is of Melania's blood, but she doesn't know whether she's a sister, daughter, or offshoot. I like the word offshoot here because the tree metaphor is pretty strong in Elden Ring when it comes to lineage, but the word is also vague enough that it doesn't specify exactly what the relationship is. I'm happy saying that Millicent is an offshoot of Melania, and that Melina is an offshoot of Marika, even if I can't get too specific on what an offshoot really is. What's more interesting to me is how Melina seems to parallel Millicent in an emphasis on autonomy and free will. Melina makes a point of telling us that her purpose was given to her by her mother inside the Erd Tree long ago, but now she's acting of her own volition. This is pretty odd because, as far as I can tell, Melina wants exactly what Marika wants: to unleash the Rune of Death, burn the Erd Tree, and kill a god. It's as if Melina is saying, I'm gonna do what Mom tells me, but I'm gonna do it because I want to do it, not because she's telling me to do it. This is a kind of weird, nuanced distinction to make, but actually it's only weird if you forgot that Radagon is Marika. Marika wants to unleash destined death, but Radagon doesn't. Radagon is opposed to Marika, and I think this makes a lot more sense in the context of Millicent and Melania. Melania let a cosmic entity take over and transform her because she couldn't accept defeat, and from the flower that bloomed as a result was created a weird offshoot version of her who didn't capitulate, who died in order to retain her sense of self. Drawing a parallel to Marika, I think this means that Marika also experienced some kind of despair or loss, which led her to allow the greater will to transform her into Radagon. And at the same time, this created an offshoot version of Marika in the form of Melina, who exemplifies Marika's autonomy and sense of self, in contrast to Marika's new form of Radagon, who is nothing more than a tool. Melina is a version of Marika that lets herself and her Erd Tree burn in order to retain her sense of self, and not flower into something else. Essentially, Melina is the alternative to Radagon. She's the Marika that chooses freely to die, instead of living on and becoming something other than herself. I think this reading explains a lot about Melina. Why she moves like a Black Knife assassin, why she can recite Marika's echoes, why she can only move freely close to the Erd Tree, why she can summon a spectral golden tree, why she can transport us to the Round Table, and why she can turn runes into strength despite not being a Finger Maiden. One way to look at this is with the metaphor that when Melina figuratively abandoned her sense of self, it literally caused herself to split off into 5 extra people. Since Marika is also split into multiple people, like Radagon and Malekith, and as I've argued, Melina, this suggests that Marika also abandoned her sense of self at some point. Also, this gets even weirder if we explore the possibility that Miquella and Melina are also pieces of Marika, which implies so are Saint Trina and Millicent and her sisters. In any case, this parallel between Melina and Marika provides a new perspective on Marika's line to Radagon, "Let us be shattered, both." But there are 2 things about Melina that I haven't explored yet. The first is the fact that she rides Torrent before giving him to us. According to the DLC promo image, Miquella appears to have been riding Torrent in the Land of Shadow, and since he's still there, we can only assume that Melina was in the Land of Shadow prior to us meeting her. I don't know what she was doing there, although I would bet that Mesmer's flame is responsible for Melina being burned and bodiless. But regardless, I will be thinking about this come DLC time. The second thing about Melina is the big elephant in the room, and that's the Gloam-Eyed Queen. A lot of people are convinced that Melina is the Gloam-Eyed Queen. Actually, many people think that it's obvious she's the Gloam-Eyed Queen. But I don't think almost anything is obvious in Elden Ring, especially when it comes to identity. Now, mainly people make this connection because of Melina's appearance in the Frenzied Flame ending. Her sealed eye opens, and it's purple, clearly the color of Gloam. But that's not necessarily true. Gloam is not specifically purple. Gloam just means twilight or dusk. Here's a picture of a scene at dusk. There's a lot of different colors going on. Red, orange, yellow, blue, purple, white, black. It's kind of the whole spectrum. A Gloam eye could be the color of gold. Actually, Fia's ending makes it seem like dusk would be associated with the color gray, if anything. But Melina's purple eye does have some meaning. That purple eye color is shared by Blaidd. So what's going on there? Well, here's what I think. Blaidd says that he's a part of Ranni's very being, and Ranni says that Blaidd was tailored for her. I think that in order to be an Empyrean, in order to become godlike, you have to separate out the vulgar, bestial aspects, like a kind of alchemy of the soul. The violent, dark, shadowy aspects have to be removed and injected into someone else, so that only the divine parts remain. Standing before a divine light casts a dark shadow behind you. I think this is why both Melina and Ranni have a sealed eye. Both Ranni and Marika had their shadow sides split off and placed into vessels in the form of Blaidd and Malekith. This could explain why Gerank's beast eye has a murky violet iris, and why Melina and Miquella don't seem to have shadows, because they were born from an already purified divine being. And it would also explain why Melina opens her purple eye at the end. This is the only ending where we see Melina after Malekith has been killed, so that shadow seal is broken. There's also a bit of data mined content that might support this. I hesitate to bring it up because developer notes are really messy and weird, and in context, this isn't nearly as much of a smoking gun as it might seem at first. But with that disclaimer, it's worth noting that there is a short developer note for the Frenzied Flame ending cutscene, which just says, Beast Death Marika. On a side note, if this explanation for the sealed eyes is correct, then that implies Mesmer also had part of himself sealed off. I don't know why, but my brain keeps saying Godwyn, even though that doesn't make much sense. Another possibility is that Miquella sealed away Saint Trina, and in the process became Mesmer in an analogous way to Marika becoming Radagon. Back to the Gloam-Eyed Queen. Let's see if we can identify who she was. But before we get into it, I want to point out that the Gloam-Eyed Queen is not just a throwaway reference. Gek skeptics have compared her to Valka from the Dark Souls series, and all the crazy theories about who Valka was and what she did. but I don't think it's really the same kind of situation. When you're world building, it's a good idea to put in throwaway references to things that aren't really part of the main story, because it makes the world seem bigger. It makes it seem like you're just getting one small story set in a much more vast and complex world. I think the message of caution and skepticism is a worthwhile one for lore theorists to hear, because there is a tendency to want to wrap everything up in a nice neat bow, to try and explain absolutely everything in a complete package, when the reality is that even with the DLC there will be plenty of loose ends. But I don't think the Gloam-Eyed Queen is something we should accept as just a loose end. We have characters like the Blind Swordsman or ELDEN John, but I don't think the Gloam-Eyed Queen belongs in the same category, for two main reasons. The world of Elden Ring is vast and it has a lot of different parts, but in my view the central plot of the base game is really focused on the demigods and the Shattering. It's about Marika's kids, and the alternate worldviews that could lead to a new age. A character like the Blind Swordsman doesn't really fit into that story in an important way, but the Gloam-Eyed Queen is an Empyrean. In fact, she's the only Empyrean mentioned besides Marika, Ranni, Miquella, and Melina. These Empyreans are candidates for godhood, people who might lead a new age, and in the context of Elden Ring's central themes, that means the Gloam-Eyed Queen is a pretty important character. If she was around before Marika rose to power, then she's a key figure in contrast to Marika's Golden Order. And if she was around after Marika rose to power, then she's a huge missing piece in the lineup of the people who might succeed Marika as god. Either way, there's a strong implication that she's directly related to Marika in some capacity. The second reason I think she's important is because she is intimately connected to Destined Death, which is the main MacGuffin of the entire story. Everything about the story we get is defined in terms of the absence or use of the Rune of Death, and the impetus for the most recent sequence of events was the use of Destined Death to kill a demigod. So a character that went around using Destined Death to kill gods is pretty damn important in that context. That just isn't something you could say about a character like Velka, for example. And apart from those two reasons, we actually get a decent amount of information about the Gloam-Eyed Queen, by Elden Ring standards. We have her sword, a whole class of incantations, Black Flame monks, and by way of the Godskins, a talisman, 2 weapons, and 5 boss fights. There's 4 item descriptions which mention her explicitly, which is 4 more than Melina has. So there's 2 possibilities here. Either the Gloam-Eyed Queen is the title of someone we already know in the game, or she's a completely different person that we've never seen. If she's a completely different person, there's a lot of conspicuously missing pieces to her story. People get stuck on the Gloam-Eye part of her name, but I think more interesting is the fact that she was a queen. What was she queen of? Queen Marika and Queen Rennala both have areas they rule, impressive buildings, knights and warriors, and a lineage, a royal family. Where's any of this for the Gloam-Eyed Queen? She's got the apostles and nobles, but these stragglers are hardly a fully fledged culture of sufficient size and complexity for their leader to deserve royal status. At the very least, I think this casts doubt on the idea that the Gloam-Eyed Queen could have been a child of Marika, because how could you be a queen at the same time that your mother is queen? Ranni is a princess, so we know that princesses are a thing in Elden Ring. So if the Gloam-Eyed Queen were a child of Marika chosen to succeed her, she should have been a Gloam-Eyed princess. Maybe the Gloam-Eyed Queen came before Marika, but this brings up an odd point. Malekith defeated the Gloam-Eyed Queen and her apostles, and then he sealed Destined Death. The implication being that one follows from the other. In fact, the apostles were said to have served Destined Death itself, almost equating the Gloam-Eyed Queen with the Rune of Death, as if she embodies it. One way to read that is to say that defeating the Gloam-Eyed Queen and sealing Destined Death are the same event. But Marika is weirdly absent from this picture. How come she didn't fight the Gloam-Eyed Queen? If Marika was the one to found the Golden Order, as is generally assumed, how come she's not involved here at its beginning? If the Gloam-Eyed Queen channeled Destined Death somehow, could she have done that before the Rune of Death was plucked from the Elden Ring, while it was still part of the ring? If she were the god before Marika, why is she so exclusively concerned with the Rune of Death? That's just one rune among many that would make up the ring she was a vessel for. But if she were just an Empyrean, how did she get the Rune of Death before it was plucked from the ring? Did Marika pluck the Rune of Death and then hand it to the Gloam-Eyed Queen? Or maybe she stole it, only to have Malekith steal it back? I think there's a more compelling explanation for all of this. Just as Millicent will transform into a Scarlet Valkyrie if she doesn't let herself die, Melina transforms into something if she doesn't sacrifice her life. And that something resembles the Gloam-Eyed Queen. If Melina is in some way part of Marika, that suggests that part of Marika is in some way the Gloam-Eyed Queen. I think Marika was the Gloam-Eyed Queen before she became god of the Golden Order. I think Malekith turned on his Empyrean in exactly the way described by Iji. Iji says that if Ranni resists becoming an instrument of the Two Fingers, Blythe will go mad, transforming from a follower into a hard curse. Nowadays, Malekith seems like he's gone mad, and amongst his beastly howls, he alludes to Marika tricking him. Malekith's remembrance speaks of how Marika's sole need of her shadow was a vessel to lock away destined death, but even then she betrayed him. I think that despite Marika seeming like the mastermind behind everything, she might have been a kind of puppet of the greater will and the Two Fingers. Being a god sounds cool at first, until you realize you're just a vessel for some cosmic entity's agenda. I think Marika was out trying to kill gods. Maybe she even tried to kill her own Two Fingers like Ranni, or maybe she tried to kill herself, but she was forced to become a figurehead for this Golden Order instead. In a way, I think Ranni might represent another kind of Marika alternative in a similar fashion to Melina. Ranni accepted her shadow and loved him instead of hiding him away, and she killed herself rather than be used by some other power. The idea that Marika was the Gloam-Eyed Queen might seem strange at first, but there's a couple other points worth bringing up here. First, Marika is likely a Numen, and associated with the Black Knife Assassins who come from the Eternal Cities, where the Nox invented mirror helms to ward off the Greater Will, and where the only weapon capable of harming the Greater Will and its vassals resides. Second, we now know that Marika had a creepy snake child who wields magic fire, and the Godskin nobles have serpent tails and also wield magic fire. Third, I pointed out in a previous video that the bald monk statues I've been obsessed with indicate a direct relationship between the Death Rites and the Golden Order. Fourth, Vargrim was one of the first Tarnished to visit the Round Table Hold, and he wields the Gloam-Eyed Queen's greatsword. Fifth, the one thing we know for sure about Marika's motivations now is that she wants to kill a god. And finally, I think the most compelling thing to me is just simply that Marika clearly has a shadowy past. She has a whole history before she became a god, which seems to be about killing and conquering people. Perhaps, in particular, delivering death to the previous era's gods. So to summarize, I think Melina is an offshoot of Marika, somehow representing Marika's free will and acceptance of death rather than her transformation into Radagon. And I think Marika was the Gloam-Eyed Queen before she became the god that we all know and love. Just to be clear, because of how weird identity is in Elden Ring, I think it's possible that the Gloam-Eyed Queen could have been Marika and also someone separate from Marika at the same time. She could have been a twin, or another person in the way that Radagon is another person, but at the same time also Marika. Let's call this a bet or a prediction, because I think the DLC will probably make it pretty clear whether I'm on the right track or not. Before we end the video, there's one extra question I want to address. Is Marika a giant snake? Now, I actually take this question a bit more seriously than you might think. I won't say the answer is yes, but let me just lay out a couple points as food for thought. First, we have Mesmer. So Marika at least had a child who has something going on with snakes, and I already pointed out the Godskin Noble's serpent tails. Second is a point about Rykard. Rykard is called a Praetor and a Justiciar. These are important official titles, and I get the impression that before he was Eden, he had a pretty important role under Marika's rule. Now, people have argued back and forth whether Marika was involved in the Night of the Black Knives, and I tend to lean towards her being involved. Ronnie says explicitly that she did it all, but Rykard was at least aware of it, because Ronnie gave him the blasphemous claw. If Marika was also in on it, then that paints a picture of Ronnie, Rykard, and Marika all conspiring together. If Rykard and Marika were more buddy-buddy than it at first seems, and if Marika was always kind of anti-Greater Will, then that makes me examine Rykard's decision to turn into a giant snake in a new light. There's also the hexes of Mount Gelmir's ancient serpent religion, which, as I pointed out in my Crucible video, have ties to both Red Glintstone and the Deathrite spells. The sort of branched sapling imagery that you find in the Bald Monk statues, the Deathrite priests, and the Smoldering Staff of the Guilty is also mirrored in the statues at the Grand Lift of Rold. To me, these statues look like the physic chemists of the early Erdtree. And if that's true, it makes me think that there's something more to this hex magic that's crucial to the early history of the Erdtree. It's also worth pointing out that the sacrificial acts of the Deathrites and the Serpent God's curved sword are sort of mirrors of one another, the former absorbing FP and the latter absorbing HP. Ghost Flame sorceries and Gelmir hexes both require intelligence and faith, just like Golden Order incantations. I'm not sure what all of that means, but I get the impression that snakes are more integral to the Erdtree's existence rather than opposed to it. Even the Caduceus tree that we see in the DLC, which I kind of predicted in my Crucible video, evokes snake-like imagery, and there's also a bunch of ulcerated tree spirits throughout the game, which seem sort of snaky. Third and final point, snakes are dragon-coded. In Dark Souls, snakes were said to be imperfect dragons, and the statues of winged snakes in Volcano Manor might hint at a similar idea in Elden Ring. If snakes are connected to dragons, that brings up a whole host of other strange things, like the fact that Lansseax took human form to commune with Godwyn's knights, and that Godric calls a dragon kindred and trueborn heir. There's also the statue of a young girl surrounded by 3 wolves in Farum Azula, and the fact that Marika's half-brother was a priest of Farum Azula. I can't really come to any sort of conclusion with all of this, but if you told me Marika was a dragon, I wouldn't dismiss the idea straight away. After all, Radagon is an anagram of a dragon. And on that bombshell, let's end the video. Once again, I'd ask that you please refrain from spoiling the DLC previews in the comments. Join the Discord to continue the conversation, and use the password Crunchy as we explore the DLC to identify fellow frenzied lore hunters. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you in the Land of Shadow.
Bye now. Take care.